You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Clavio joining you. Happy Sunday, May 4th, 2025. A dreary day here in Bloomington this morning, but always a good day to podcast. And I appreciate you folks tuning in, going solo on this one. Not a terribly long podcast today, so maybe good for a short dog walk or whatever you do with short podcasts. But part two of the mailbag, we did a longer mailbag, myself and Scott, a couple of days ago. So if you haven't had a chance to go back and watch or listen to that, I'm going to tackle some more questions, including a couple of new things that have come up since the last time that we podcasted. So going to dive into that, and we'll have more podcasts coming up here relatively soon. We're going to wait on doing a football recruiting wrap with Taylor Lehman until probably the middle of not this upcoming week, but the week after. Wanted to wait until more portal dust cleared. But a lot of good things going on for IU, including one addition in the portal that I'm going to talk about at some point during this podcast. But we're going to do the full view, especially on the recruiting front, probably around May 14th or 15th. So don't get impatient. We will be working on that. Quick reminder, folks, we're brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabric, the coolest designs. I'm wearing, of course, maybe the most classic of IU Home Field apparel, other than the Kick Was Good shirts, of course, the Bison hoodie, which you can still buy on the Home Field website. Go to homefieldapparel.com or follow them on the socials, download the app, use the code HOME23, get 15% off your first order if you didn't catch the Indy 500 drop. We've already got it here in the house, and it was awesome to see how cool that set of things looked and how quickly it shipped. It was really impressive. So go over to homefieldapparel.com. You've got all the IU apparel you could possibly want and more, as well as Indy 500 apparel, Little 500 apparel, and apparel from across the collegiate landscape. Again, homefieldapparel.com, proud presenting sponsor of the Back Home Network. Speaking of the Back Home Network, we are on YouTube. Search Back Home Network on YouTube, and you can find all of our shows there and join the over 7,500 people that have subscribed to the channel, get alerts whenever we post a show or when a new show goes live. And of course, not just CrimsonCast, but you also get Assembly Call in that mix, doing the work, the dribble drive. There's a ton of other things that we've got there, which I think you'd enjoy. We're going to be adding hopefully some new shows to the mix here over the course of the summer and fall, trying to satisfy all of your podcasting needs when it comes to IU and Bloomington. So again, head over there. You can also subscribe to CrimsonCast directly on Substack, crimsoncast.substack.com. Give us a follow there. Subscribe for free. There's also a paid option if you want to help support the podcast, $5 a month, $50 a year. We appreciate the support. Again, crimsoncast.substack.com. All right, let's dive in as we've got several updates, some IU related, some Bloomington related, and some that are happening out in the society around us. First of all, a news item from last night that was really encouraging. IU plugging a hole that had been generated during the spring practice period. As, of course, IU loses one receiver to injury, and they add another one. And this one is one that Fernando Mendoza, the quarterback for IU for this upcoming year, knows very well. His former target at Cal, Jonathan Brady, commits to Indiana. Brady, 97 receptions and 11 touchdowns through the 3 years he was at Cal. He was the third leading receiver for Cal last year, had 36 catches through 13 games, 386 yards, 3 touchdowns. And a nice pickup for Indiana. Probably not your number one target, but certainly a guy that's got FBS experience and power conference experience, and third leading receiver on a team in the ACC last year. That's nothing to sneeze at. So another weapon for Fernando Mendoza to throw to, and kind of fleshes out that receiving core a little bit more, which I know a lot of people had some questions about. We had seen from Taylor Lehman on Bite Size Bison about some of the options that they might be going to in terms of trying to fill a hole here or there, but this looks like they've done that, and that's certainly exciting to see. I'm looking forward to seeing who else, if anybody, IU decides to pull in the portal, but IU still obviously very active, and between that and what we're seeing on the recruiting front, it's been a really good spring so far for IU football. So we'll see what else Kurt Cignetti and the guys have cooking, but that one was a good one to see. And, we got the customary, it's a great day to be a Hoosier tweets coming out earlier in the day about that. So it was nice to have a little bit of advanced warning on X about what was going on. So good stuff from IU, and looking forward to seeing what ends up happening with the rest of the roster. As, obviously spring ball's tapered off. We got a long summer awaiting the start of the football season. We'll see what Indiana is able to do, and we'll talk more about that again in about a week and a half. We had some questions just kind of in general about some of the various aspects going on outside in the world of college sports. And I did want to tackle those a little bit and then jump back in and talk some IU stuff, because I keep getting questions about what's going on with the House settlement, with NIL, with all of these things. We had a question from Hoosier Gal in Iowa. Can you give an update on the latest happenings with revenue sharing and potential implications? We had a couple of other questions from folks. Hoosier Dada asking, what are the implications of Kentucky spinning off their athletics program into an LLC? Wouldn't they lose massive tax incentives? We've got several of those sorts of questions. And, it's almost impossible to answer all of them right now in terms of how everything's going to ultimately play out, because there's just a ton of uncertainty going on in terms of the college model and how it's going to eventually take form, and if that form actually ends up being able to stay in one place, or if the courts end up being a consistent issue. But let me try to reset what's gone on over the course of the last month, and then also talk about where we're at in terms of the overall setup with college athletics and how things might play out moving forward. So, I said back in March that I was going to do a podcast series about NIL and about revenue sharing and about this new model, and I'm still planning on doing that. But things keep getting added to the mix that kind of make everybody scratch their heads, and it's hard to keep track of what's going on. So you've got this situation with the House settlement where Claudia Wilken, who's the judge in that case, essentially looked at the settlement, and for those who don't know or aren't familiar with the terms, the settlement essentially did a few really important things. First thing that it did was it said, we're going to pay athletes that were in the NCAA from like 2015 until 2021, essentially back pay in repair for the lack of NIL money that they experienced during that time period. And then for athletes moving forward, the idea was, all right, we're going to establish a fund like a budget carve out of up to $21 million that colleges and universities and their athletic departments would pay athletes directly. And then that could be supplemented by outside NIL payments, but all of those would have to go through a clearinghouse of sorts to evaluate the deals to make sure that they were in concert with fair market value, whatever that means in this case. And it also essentially allowed the NCAA to create roster limits on sports. So instead of having walk-ons, you could have a larger number of scholarships, but you'd have to give full scholarships, and the numbers would go up to a certain level. But it meant that a large number of athletes would not be allowed to continue as college athletes. There would have to be roster cuts based upon these new numbers. I'm purposely kind of trying to keep this as simple as possible. Well, a lot of those athletes and their representatives essentially protested the settlement, saying, well, no, that's not fair and that's not right. And the judge essentially agreed. Like, she asked the NCAA and its member institutions, like, please do something about this. Have some kind of a tapering in place so that you don't just have a bunch of athletes who are no longer eligible to play simply because you've arbitrarily set down that X, Y, and Z has to happen by this date. And the NCAA and its member institutions, as they are wont to do, said, nah, we're good. We've already decided this is the best way to do things, and we're not going to listen to you. So the judge said, I'm not approving the settlement, and I'm going to give you some time to try to figure this out. And if you don't, I might not approve the settlement at all. And so that's where we're at. Now, it does feel like the colleges and universities might finally take this judge's advice and do what she's asking. This is not too different from how we got to our NIL situation in the first place. The NCAA and its member institutions have just never gotten their heads wrapped around the idea that they can't simply dictate terms here. I mean, they're very used to dictating terms. The NCAA essentially, for its almost, well, not going to say its entire history, but certainly since the NCAA decided back in the 40s that it was going to become the police of college sports, they have gotten very used to saying, these are the rules and you must abide by these rules and it's our way or the highway. And so that, when you go back and you look at the way the NCAA has managed itself over the years, that's been their approach with almost everything. And it's kind of funny because the NCAA, from an enforcement perspective, has always just tried to leverage its own schools' like shame in policing these rules that it has come up with. And everybody would always fall in line. And then what's happened over the last 15 to 20 years is that gradually we've seen schools not fall in line, which has led to the courts suddenly taking a closer look and saying, these rules don't make any sense. And you look at a lot of the big rules violations that took place over the course of the last 10, 15 years, probably the most egregious being North Carolina with their academic fraud scandal. But there have been other examples of this as well, where, schools have essentially decided that they're not going to follow along with what the NCAA says, and they're going to throw up a lot of barriers in court to try to protect themselves from being policed from the rules that they themselves have abided by for a while. We've talked about this on the show before. But this is a little bit different because what you're talking about here wraps a whole bunch of different things into one. So you're talking about not just athlete pay, but you're also talking about athlete eligibility. And that has been a big thing that has grown in importance within the confines of college athletics over the course of the last couple of years, as athletes have started to sue to get extra years of eligibility because they know that if they are able to play high-level Division I sports, especially basketball and football, they have access to getting paid a much higher amount of money than they would get in many cases by trying to go and play professionally somewhere. And so what you've got going on right now is a bunch of different threads being pulled on simultaneously that essentially affect the entire NCAA model, not just should athletes get paid or should athletes be considered employees, but what is eligibility? We got used to this idea that, eligibility, you get 4 years of college eligibility, you get 5 years to play those 4. That was always how it was. And then it changed to, you get those 5 years to play 4, but if you're a grad student, you can transfer and go play somewhere else as long as they have a graduate program that you can go enroll in that you don't have at your current institution. Then COVID happened, and it was like, everybody gets an extra year. So now you've got some guys playing 5 years of basketball, girls too, or football. Some people playing, be able to stretch that out. You've got injury exceptions. You've got all these things. You've got junior college players coming into the NCAA saying, wait a minute, why do the 2 years in junior college count? Why can't I get extra years according to just playing at the NCAA level? Why is that being regulated? So that's being challenged in court. So all of these things are kind of wrapped around the same core set of issues. And essentially where we're at right now is this combination of 3 different threads, I would say, 3 main threads coming together simultaneously. You've got an NCAA that can't really effectively define or defend its own structure from a payment and eligibility system. Eligibility, they probably have a better argument on, in as much as there should be some standardized rules. The problem is they've given so many exceptions, it's hard to defend those rules in court. Compensation is a much harder one. And this is where I think most people still don't have their brains wrapped around what's happened with the NCAA, and not even like our political leaders. So yesterday, there was an article that came out, I think it might have been 2 days ago, depending on when you're listening to this, about Donald Trump going to the University of Alabama, and then Nick Saban and him having a meeting, and essentially, I guess Tommy Tuberville was in this mix as well, the senator from Alabama, the former head coach at Auburn and Texas Tech and Cincinnati. But there's this story, and Sportico has some coverage of it today, saying that President Donald Trump is reportedly weighing issuing an executive order that would attempt to place restrictions on college athlete compensation. And essentially the idea here is that this executive order would theoretically provide stable and predictable rules for compensating college athletes. So I guess the idea here, and this has been applauded in certain circles, is like, an executive order saying that college athletes can't be recognized as employees, which seems to be the one thing that the NCAA is the most desperate to preserve, this idea that athletes are not employees. But the problem is that executive orders don't really have a lot of enforceable weight when it comes to these kinds of things. And it was a good article by Michael McCann, the lawyer that writes for Sportico, about this. I'm going to kind of paraphrase a couple of items in this section that I think are worth keeping in mind if you're listening to this and trying to figure out what's going on. For starters, an executive order, I'm quoting the piece here. For starters, an executive order can't conflict with a federal statute. If a court finds that college athletes are employees within the meaning of the National Labor Relations Act or the Fair Labor Standards Act, they will be employees. If a court finds they aren't employees, then they aren't employees. There's also state laws that supersede federal laws in certain states or certain ways, not certain states. And this is where the legal elements get kind of complicated. But, essentially, there are legal arguments that are working their way through the courts or already have, that when you look at the way, like, and again, quoting here, the New York labor law, the North Carolina Wage and Hour Act, the Arizona Minimum Wage Act define employment, that they are employees by those basic definitions. You've also even got this whole idea of restricting athlete compensation, which within the college game, I think is an important thing to keep in mind, because what you're seeing right now is essentially an unregulated marketplace. So when you're shocked that, a shooting guard from the Sun Belt might get $1.5 million or $2 million a year in an NIL deal, or, the BYU signed, I think, Baylor's point guard for $3 million a year. Like, these are ridiculous numbers. They're ridiculous numbers when you compare them to what NBA rookies would be making under the same age basketball player. You're limited quite a bit to what you can make even as a high draft pick until you get to the end of that rookie contract, which is normally 4 years. What you see right now is what happens when there's a completely unregulated marketplace, a high demand for particular levels of talent, and schools and universities that have the money right now and are willing to pay it because that's what they have to do in order to maintain some level of competition with the teams that they're in competition with. NIL is not a federal thing. NIL, like, the federal government has nothing to do with NIL per se. I've talked a lot about how the floodgates opened for NIL back in the summer of 2021, but that was not some kind of a ruling by the Supreme Court that said, hey, everybody, now you can do NIL. What it basically said, that Supreme Court ruling, was the NCAA, what you've been arguing about how you can control athlete compensation, doesn't exist. It's not legally valid. And this is where I think the NCAA keeps hitting its head against the ceiling on all of these rulings, is that the NCAA, from about the early 1950s until the present, was kind of left alone to define this fantasy world wherein it was able to dictate the terms of compensation for an entire classification of people that were in turn, in many cases, making these colleges and universities a significant amount of money, making coaches a significant amount of money. But it was all essentially controlled under the guise of this thing called amateurism, which doesn't exist as a labor statute. It's not something that actually exists within the marketplace. And the courts, when they finally looked at it, when they finally had to look at the NCAA's insistence that they have total control over how athletes could be compensated, even with like fringe things within, like getting extra money for food or stuff like that. That's really what the Alston case was about that led to this. The court said this is not something that you can enforce. This, your labor market is not so special and your business is not so special that it can supersede employment laws that exist within the United States. You can't just tell somebody they can't be paid by an outside party. You don't have any standing to do that. And so that's why what we've seen over the course of the last 4 years has been essentially the NCAA trying to get Congress to step in and say, oh, actually, they have a special exemption where they can do whatever they want. And, that's that. The NCAA made a lot of arguments during this whole process with this, not just this case, but most of the other cases, saying that, well, if college athletics is professionalized, then and if the athletes are paid, then nobody will watch the games. It'll destroy our business model. That's been proven not true, as we've seen NIL money go up and up. And yes, certainly you've got people who are upset with the amount of money that's being paid to athletes, and some people who are like, well, the game isn't the same for me. And yet you've got just as many people who are watching and enjoying college sports. Attendance has not dropped. TV ratings have gone up. And college sports continues to thrive, essentially. But you've got the NCAA consistently pushing against these ideas of not just athlete employment, but also the general concept of player compensation. So this idea of like an executive order fixing all of this sounds like not a whole lot different, I think, to the average person than, we'll get an exemption from Congress. We'll get some kind of an antitrust exemption and that'll solve everything. An antitrust exemption from Congress would solve things because that's where the power can lie. But that's not what we're talking about with an executive order, which can't supersede state laws. NIL, and this is where I think a lot of people get confused, NIL is not a federal statute. It's the right of publicity. Right of publicity is not a federal thing. It's a state-by-state thing. And right of publicity essentially says that people have the ability to make money off of who they are and what their image is. And that's not something that a federal court can come in unless you wanted to try to pass a nationwide right of publicity law, which is not on the cards within this. And so the NCAA, again, finds itself in this situation with its member schools where it is already said that it wants to go to this system where it's paying athletes directly. And that is a step in the right direction just in terms of fairness and equity and reality. But they're also trying to tell everybody we don't want anybody outside to pay athletes because we want to be the ones controlling things, which is essentially just a different version of what we were talking about in earlier eras. And the problem is like there's not really a good way to meter this out unless all of the colleges and universities get together and essentially say, we're going to form a league, a closed system like the NBA, like the NHL, like Major League Baseball, and we're going to collectively bargain with a group of people, in this case, athletes. Bubba Cunningham, the North Carolina athletic director, had some piece yesterday or some interview yesterday where he's like, I favor a collective bargaining model, but I still don't think athletes should be employees. And this is where it's just like the message is not getting across to college athletics leaders. Who are you collectively bargaining with if they aren't employees would be the question that you ask there. Like to have a collective bargaining situation, you have to have two parties. You have to have a labor union, which is made up of employees, and you have to have a trade group essentially made up of teams or colleges and universities in this case. All these things kind of fall into, it's a very confusing set of circumstances that probably doesn't have a simple answer. The question about Kentucky moving to an LLC model and whether there would be, negative tax implications, I think it's to some degree, it's an open question whether that ends up being the model. I think it probably is, in as much as if colleges and universities don't want to make athletes direct employees, but instead, want to find a different pathway, the pathway might be to make them employees of an external entity that is somehow connected to the university in terms of licensing the marks and logos and branding and using the arenas without necessarily having to be a direct employee of the university. I still don't entirely understand what the opposition is to athletes being employees, in as much as there are thousands of student employees on college campuses all across the country, including here at Indiana University. I employ several students in part-time jobs, and they fill in a time card and they get paid and they get taxed on that money. I mean, this is not a new concept. Like, all of this exists within the college environment already. So I do find the complete and utter resistance to the employment model to be kind of bizarre at this stage. And for those who are like, well, this isn't what college athletics is all about, my argument on that front is essentially that's an accident of the court system, not a reality of the actual labor or job model that you've got in place here, where, by any definition, yes, you can still go to school and you can be an employee at the same time. Like, these things do not have to be mutually exclusive. It's just that employment triggers a bunch of protections that aren't currently provided to athletes, which would be more complicated, but it's something that's done in a variety of different areas across the country and across the world. It's just that the NCAA and its schools have gotten very used to being able to dictate all of the terms with these sorts of things. And that may ultimately be at the heart of why they're so opposed to the whole idea of an employment model, is that would not be the case anymore. It would also be too expensive for some schools to really actively participate in or be competitive in. But again, I think the flip side of that argument is that level of competitive interaction or competitive balance has been artificially created over time by a business model that does not exist in actual reality, but just in the fantasy land that the NCAA was able to conjure up over the course of the last 75 years. So a lot of stuff to happen here. So, if you hear about an executive order fixing college sports, it's probably not going to fix college sports. It'll be symbolic, but the chances of Congress, who has the actual power in this case, actually getting together and fixing something relating to the college model, or the courts saying, hey, let's go back to the way it was, that's probably not happening. So that's probably not going to clear that much up for those of you out there who are wondering what's going on. But there's a reason why, and that is it's still very confusing. And it's confusing even for those of us that have really watched all of these different cases and all of these different elements play out over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. So I think, we'll see what happens. I do think ultimately the NCAA is going to have to cave on the House, items related to roster limits and the cuts that have happened. And that's going to create some problems, because if they don't do the settlement, they can now be sued in open court over lack of prior NIL compensation, which is what the House case was about. And it could literally bankrupt the entire NCAA, because you'd be talking about damages potentially up to $10 billion. The NCAA does not have $10 billion. So we'll keep an eye on things. And like I said, once we get some clarity on the House settlement, I'm going to go back in, deep dive each of these areas, talk about how this started, how we got to where we have gotten to, and what it means as we try to move forward through things. Let's go to some other questions. Robotic Hoosier asked, are we going to see a college basketball video game anytime soon? This actually kind of ties right into the NIL thing. I actually think we will. One of the things about the last generation of college basketball games, which really was sadly 15 years ago, you had College Hoops, which was by 2K Sports, my favorite of the entire history of college basketball video games. College Hoops 2K8 was the last one that came out from that publishing house, and then EA had a college basketball game that came out in 2009. It was labeled 2010 because the NCAA had switched to a model where EA had exclusive rights to basketball as well as football. But then they stopped that game, largely because it wasn't selling as well as they wanted. But then they also, of course, in 2013, and I know it was NCAA 14, but it came out in 13, the last iteration of the college football game, they had to stop that because they were being sued for using the names, images, and likenesses of college basketball players without compensating them. That's what the O'Bannon case was about, if you remember that. Now, since then, obviously, a lot's happened. We finally had a college football game come out last year. It's a pretty good first effort, all things considered. It certainly had some problems, but it became a relatively enjoyable game once you learn how the systems worked. That game actually had EA paying players directly for their name, image, and likeness, and their names were in the game. That was cool to see because that was always a reasonable outcome when it came to this game and how it should be. Just same way that it happens, in Madden, for instance. There's a direct bargaining with the NFL Players Association over name, image, and likeness. So it was nice to see the college game finally do the same thing. Could have happened 10 years ago. There's suddenly a bit of a groundswell of interest in doing a college basketball game, partially because it's been so long, but also, there are elements of the college basketball experience that I think actually translate pretty well to the video game world. So I would anticipate that, yes, we'll probably see something along those lines within the next couple of years. I've heard some rumors here or there. I doubt we'll see anything come out. Like, even if something got announced right now, we would probably not see that get released until fall of 26 at the earliest. So I wouldn't be shocked if we heard an announcement over the summer that somebody was working on that. I don't know if it would be, I doubt it would be EA. I'm guessing it would probably be 2K, which would be great. I think all things considered, since they've already got the model and the engine in place with the NBA series. So keeping my fingers crossed. I've always really enjoyed college basketball games on video, on the video game systems. So we'll see what happens there. But I do think it will happen. It might be next year. It might be 2 years from now. And I think some of it's going to depend on ultimately what happens with some of the settlements that are going on, because ultimately that's going to dictate how many teams are in a college basketball game to begin with. Because college basketball itself might change significantly over the course of the next couple of years. Let's see. Let's talk a little bit more. We had a bunch of questions about what's going on with the restaurant scene in Bloomington. Kurt Gutskill, or I hope I probably mispronounced that. I'm sorry, Kurt. And a couple of others asking some questions on that front. So I can tell you all, like, restaurant-wise, not a whole lot of real huge change from the last update that I gave. Obviously, this past year, we lost a couple of longtime restaurants in Bloomington. Cafe Pizzeria deciding to go out of business right at the start of last year. The Irish Lion going out of business as well. So now you've got kind of the same general mix of higher level dining, and you've got a couple of new entries into the bar and beer scene, although we've talked about a lot of those up to this point. So looking at, kind of what's at the core of the Bloomington experience right now, you've obviously got Uptown Cafe, which had a big menu revamp over the course of the last, I think, 6 to 8 months. They kind of went back to some of their more classic menu options, which meant some of the items that people had gotten used to had gotten taken off. But Uptown continues to be an incredibly good, incredibly consistent experience. The Elm has continued. If you haven't been to the Elm yet, I recommend giving it a shot. It is basically its second, well, it's close to second in Henderson. I think it's between like second in Henderson and second in Fess, down there in Elm Heights. So a few blocks south of campus. It's in a building that's had several different lives now. It used to be a small grocery store back, for those of you who were in school in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. And then it got renovated, was supposed to be, I think actually Blooming Foods was in there briefly, and then they weren't. And then it was supposed to be a restaurant, and then it wasn't. And then it was going to be a brewery, and then it wasn't. And now it is the Elm. And they've been there for, I think, 3 years now, 3 or 4 years. And it's been a very good experience every time I've gone. We actually had our Back Home Network reunion dinner back there in February when everybody came into town for the live podcast event. Looking around elsewhere in town, obviously you've had a few other new things open. There's a Taco Bell Cantina open on East 3rd Street over by Red Lobster and, across 3rd Street from Eastland Plaza. I have not been in there. I have friends who have gone in. It's there's a bit of an issue because there's no drive-through at that property, I don't believe, and so it's a little bit inconvenient to get in and out of. You've had some changes over on the east side in that you took out both the Taco Bell and the KFC. There's now a car wash in that location, but there haven't been a whole lot of like immense changes in terms of like the actual restaurants themselves. You do have new ownership, I think, at Malibu Grill, and that's probably a place that needed new ownership. It had not been quite the same as it had been in the past. You've got moving up and in the square area, you've still got kind of that same grouping of places. Further north, you do have the rebirth of Max's Place, which for a long time was on the square. If you remember, on the north side of the square, you always have Samira there on the corner. You had Grazie, which became Cabello, which is still there. And then for a while, there was a place called Q Billiards, which then turned into Max's Place, I think around 2006, 2007. It was there for about 8 years. And then that turned into King Doe. And then King Doe went out of business. So this is Max's Place reborn. It's actually up where Swing In Pizza moved after it moved out of its original location on 17th Street. So basically at the corner of 17th and College, you've got Square Donuts, and then you've got Max's Place. Recommend checking Max's Place out. The pizza's really good. They have an open mic night there. It's relatively close to the stadium areas, but it's got some parking both along the street and in the back, and so good spot to go check out if you haven't been there already. And certainly, a lot of other restaurants and locations. Another one up in the area there in the northern part of Bloomington that I mentioned when I went through everything in August is Heartwork Brewing, which has added some food options on top of having a really good selection of beer. So if you like beer, I would go check that out. That is essentially in the building next to where Colorado Steakhouse used to be. For those of you who were around back in the 90s or 2000s and remember Colorado Steakhouse. Trying to think if there's anything else that really sticks out in terms of new additions. I can't think of anything off the top of my head that we haven't already talked about recently. But we'll do a full kind of reset of what's going on in the Bloomington bar and restaurant scene at the start of the football season, about 2 weeks before, so we can get everybody ready to go for coming back to town and watching IU play football this year. Looking through, seeing if we have any other questions that make a lot of sense to talk about right now. It doesn't appear that we do. There was some interesting news last night about Anthony Leal supposedly applying to get an extra year of eligibility and is not in the portal. So there's a non-zero chance that you might see Anthony Leal back in an Indiana uniform for next year. I don't know what the chances of that are. There is an argument there just in terms of, again, going back to the eligibility situation and what all that means. There are a lot of players for whom they're looking at this and they're saying, well, wait, if I only played in like a certain number of games in a given year, why should that count against my eligibility? The NCAA has basically said, well, if you got injured and you only played at a certain number of games, then you get an extra year of eligibility. Like, I'm sure players are asking in court, why does the injury status matter? And I don't know what the NCAA is going to argue in court about why it should have make any difference. Luke Goody, of course, also still applying for a waiver. We haven't heard any news on that at this point, but a non-zero chance that both Leal and Goody might be in an Indiana uniform again next season. We'll hold off on speculation or judgment on that until we actually see something happen. And that would be an interesting scenario if that actually ended up turning out that way. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for this one. I wanted to keep this relatively short with the idea that we'll do another one of these relatively soon, but hopefully some explanations for you all about certain things going on within college athletics that might be helpful as we push on through May here and hopefully at some point have an idea of who's getting paid what, who is the arbitrator of who gets paid what, and how college athletics is going to survive what is a pretty difficult time right now as it tries to both readjust its business model and fight readjusting its business model all on the fly. It's absolutely a crazy time right now in college sports. So a lot more to talk about as we're moving forward with things. But we'll wrap up with that. My thanks to all of you for tuning in as always. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and a wonderful first part of May, always my favorite month of the year. For CrimsonCast and for the Back Home Network, I'm Galen Clavio. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.